Picture this, a $5 million house, a sprawling estate just outside Atlanta with ivy-covered walls and windows that catch the sun rise like a painting. It wasn't just a house to me. It was my father's legacy, the place he built with his own hands, the place he left me when he died 3 years ago. He used to tell me, Amelia, this is your sanctuary. Raise your family here, keep it safe. And I did, or at least I tried. Until the day my husband, Jake, turned it into a prison I couldn't escape. That's where this story begins. Not with a dream, but with a nightmare that crept in so quietly, I didn't see it coming until it was too late. My name is Amelia Carter. I'm 32, a mom to a 2-year-old tornado named Ethan. And up until a few months ago, I thought I had my life figured out. The house was mine. Legally, emotionally, spiritually. My dad had been a businessman, tough as nails but soft as a teddy bear when it came to me and Ethan. When he passed, he left me everything, the house, the memories, and a promise that I'd never have to worry. Jake and I had been married 5 years, and while he wasn't perfect, always distracted by his tech startup dreams, I thought we were a team. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, one I'll never forget. It started with a phone call. I was in the kitchen slicing apples for Ethan's snack when Jake walked in, his phone pressed to his ear. He didn't look at me, just muttered a quick, "Yeah, Mom, that sounds fine," before hanging up. I barely had time to ask who it was before he dropped the bomb. "Hey, Amelia," he said, casual as if he were ordering pizza. "My parents are moving in with us for a while. Their place is getting renovated and they need somewhere to crash." I froze, the knife hovering over the cutting board. "Wait, what?" I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. "You didn't even ask me, Jake." He shrugged, that lazy half shrug I'd grown to hate over the years. "That's not a big deal, it's just temporary. Besides, this house is huge. Plenty of room for all of us." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but there wasn't one. "Jake," I said, trying to keep my tone even, "this isn't just our house. It's in my name. My dad left it to me." He finally looked up from his phone, his brown eyes narrowing slightly. "Come on, Amelia. Don't make this a thing. It's my house too. We're married. And they're family." "You wouldn't get it." That stung. My family, my dad, my brother Liam, had been about warmth, late-night talks over coffee, and respect. Jake's family, they were different. His mom, Margaret Pierce, was a retired real estate agent who acted like she owned every room she walked into. His dad, Thomas, was a silent shadow, always lurking with a judgmental stare. I'd never been close to them, but I tolerated them for Jake's sake. Now they were coming here, into my sanctuary, and I didn't get a say. 2 days later, the doorbell rang. I was upstairs reading Ethan a story. Goodnight Moon, his favorite, when I heard it. Jake yelled, "I got it!" And before I could even put the book down, I heard Margaret's voice echoing through the foyer. "Oh, this place is stunning. A little dated, but we can fix that." I carried Ethan downstairs, his tiny hand gripping mine. And there they were, Margaret and Thomas, standing in my living room with 3 suitcases and a look that said they were here to... Margaret swept in, her perfume hitting me like a wave, and gave me a tight, fake smile. "Amelia, dear, you look tired. Rough day with the little one?" Her eyes flicked to Ethan, who clung to my leg. "He's so pale. You're not feeding him that sugary cereal, are you? Kids need proper nutrition." I forced a smile, my jaw tight. "He's fine, Margaret, just had some apples." She raised an eyebrow like I'd said he'd eaten dirt, then turned to Jake. "We'll take the master suite upstairs. Thomas needs the space for his back." I blinked. The master suite? That was our room, mine and Jake's. Before I could protest, Jake nodded. "Sure, Mom, I'll move our stuff." I shot him a look, but he avoided my eyes, already hauling a suitcase up the stairs. That night, I stood in the guest room, our new bedroom, watching Ethan sleep in his crib. The house felt different, smaller, like the walls were closing in. Downstairs, I could hear Margaret rearranging the kitchen, her voice sharp as she told Thomas where to put the dishes. "This place needs order," she said, loud enough for me to hear. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. This wasn't temporary. This was an invasion. The next morning, it got worse. I came down to make Ethan breakfast, only to find Margaret already there, pouring some fancy organic oatmeal into a bowl. "I threw out that cereal," she said, not even looking at me. "Ethan deserves better than processed junk." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "Margaret, I'm his mom. I decide what he eats." She turned, her lips curling into a smirk. "Oh, sweetie, I'm just helping." "You're so busy, or not busy enough since you don't work. Someone has to step up." My blood boiled. But before I could snap back, Jake walked in, kissed her cheek, and said, "Thanks, Mom, looks great." He didn't even glance at me. I stood there, holding Ethan's hand, feeling like a stranger in my own home. My dad's voice echoed in my head, "Keep it safe, Amelia." But how could I, when the people I trusted most were tearing it apart? I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning, a spark that would ignite a fire I couldn't control. I thought Margaret was just an overbearing mother-in-law, the kind you grit your teeth and tolerate until they leave, but I was wrong. She wasn't just here to rearrange my kitchen or criticize my parenting. She was a shadow from my past, a ghost I didn't even know existed until I stumbled into the truth. It wasn't just my house she'd invaded. It was my father's life, his peace, and maybe even his grave. And Jake? He knew all along. The first week with Margaret and Thomas in the house was suffocating. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of Margaret's heels clicking on my hardwood floors, her voice barking orders like she was staging a hostile takeover. She didn't just move in, she claimed everything. The kitchen became her domain. My carefully organized shelves now stuffed with her overpriced spices and gadgets I'd never use. She'd hover over me when I fed Ethan, her arms crossed, that smug look plastered on her face. "Oatmeal again, Amelia? You know a real breakfast sets a child up for life. Maybe that's why he's so fussy." I'd bite my tongue, hard enough to taste blood, and mutter, "He likes it, Margaret." She'd laugh, a short, sharp sound that made my skin crawl. "Well, I suppose you're doing your best." Jake was no help. He'd breeze through the chaos, earbuds in, typing on his laptop like nothing was wrong. When I tried to talk to him, really talk, he'd wave me off. "Amelia, she's just trying to help." "You're overreacting." I wanted to scream. This wasn't help. This was domination. One night, after Ethan was asleep, I cornered him in the cramped guest room we'd been relegated to. "Jake, she's taking over everything. She threw out Ethan's cereal, rearranged the kitchen, and now she's telling me how to raise our son. You need to say something." He sighed, rubbing his temples like I was the exhausting one. "It's temporary, okay? Just deal with it. She's my mom." I stared at him, the man I'd married, and wondered when he'd stopped being on my side. It wasn't just Margaret's control that gnawed at me. It was the way she made me feel small, like I didn't belong in my own home. My dad had built this place for me, poured his heart into every brick, and now it was slipping through my fingers. I couldn't let that happen. Late one night, while the house was quiet, I crept down to the basement. I needed proof, the deed, the paperwork, something to remind Jake this was my house, not his playground to loan out. The air down there was damp, the shelves lined with boxes of my dad's old stuff. I found the file I needed, the deed with my name in bold black ink, and breathed a sigh of relief. But as I turned to leave, my elbow knocked over a small metal box tucked behind some books. It hit the floor with a clang, papers spilling out like a confession. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I picked up the first letter. It was in my dad's handwriting, shaky and uneven, dated 10 years ago. "Margaret," it began, "I've paid you enough. I can't keep doing this. You've taken everything, my pride, my peace. Leave my family alone." My stomach dropped. There were more, dozens of letters, receipts, bank statements showing transfers to Margaret Pierce over 2 decades. One stood out, dated just before my dad died. "You win. I'm done fighting. But if you ever touch Amelia, I'll haunt you from the grave." My breath caught in my throat. Touch me? What did that mean? Then I found it. A single page, typed, unsigned, but the words burned into my brain. Jake isn't Thomas's son. You know it. I know it. Keep paying or everyone will. I sat there, the cold concrete biting into my knees, tears streaming down my face. Margaret had blackmailed my dad. Jake was the product of an affair she'd covered up, and my dad had paid to keep her secret, paid with money, with his health, with his life. He'd been a shell of himself those last years, always looking over his shoulder, and I'd never known why. Now I did. She'd destroyed him, and now she was here, in his house, smirking at me like she'd won all over again. The basement door creaked open, and Jake's voice called down. "Amelia, what are you doing?" I shoved the letters back into the box, but not fast enough. He came down, his eyes landing on the mess, then on me. His face went pale, the color draining like he'd seen a ghost. "What's that?" he asked, though his voice told me he already knew. I stood, clutching the box to my chest, my voice shaking with rage. "You knew, didn't you? You knew what she did to my dad." He looked away, his jaw tight. "Amelia, it's not what you think. She didn't mean to hurt him. She just needed the money back then." "Needed the money?" I spat, stepping closer. "She blackmailed him for years, Jake. He died because of her, because of you keeping her secret." He flinched, but didn't deny it. "Liv, please," he said, using that old nickname like it could fix this. "Don't dig this up. It's in the past. Mom's not like that anymore." I laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Not like that. She's in my kitchen right now, acting like she owns me. And you let her?" I pushed past him, the box still in my arms, my mind racing. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was personal, a war that started long before I knew I was in it. Margaret wasn't just a guest, she was a predator, and Jake was her shield. I didn't know what I'd do with this truth, but one thing was clear. I couldn't let her win again. Not over me, not over Ethan, not over my dad's memory. I could have forgiven the invasion of my house, maybe even the way Margaret turned Jake against me. I could have swallowed the pain of knowing she'd broken my dad, buried it deep for Ethan's sake, but when I heard her say she'd take my son, my little boy, the only piece of light I had left, something inside me snapped. This wasn't just a fight for a house anymore. It was a fight for my life, for my child, and I'd be damned if I let her win. The days after I found those letters were a blur of rage and fear. I couldn't look at Margaret without seeing my dad's shaky handwriting, his pleas for mercy. She didn't notice, or didn't care. She kept up her reign over the house like nothing had changed, her voice cutting through the air every morning as she fixed everything I did. "Ethan's blanket is too thin, Amelia," she'd say, swapping it for some overpriced wool thing I hadn't approved. "It needs structure, not your chaos." I'd nod, my throat tight, clutching the secret of her past like a weapon I wasn't ready to use. Jake stayed oblivious, or pretended to, disappearing into his work while I drowned in her shadow. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, past midnight, and I couldn't sleep. The guest room felt like a cage, Ethan's soft breathing the only thing keeping me sane. I slipped downstairs for water, barefoot, moving quiet as a ghost. That's when I heard them, Margaret and Jake, whispering in the living room. I froze behind the wall, my heart pounding as her voice slithered through the dark. "Ethan needs a real family, Jake," she said, low and deliberate. "Amelia's a mess. She can't even control herself, let alone him. I've got a lawyer lined up. We can prove she's unfit, take him ourselves." Jake's reply was muffled, hesitant. "Mom, that's extreme. She's his mom." Margaret snorted, barely. "You've seen her temper. We've got recordings, her yelling, crying. The court will see she's unstable." Recordings? My stomach twisted. I thought back to the fights, the times I'd snapped at her, raised my voice when she pushed too far. Had she been baiting me, waiting for me to crack? I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing as Jake muttered, "I don't know, Mom. What about the house?" Margaret's laugh was cold. "Once Ethan's with us, she'll cave." She won't risk losing him over a pile of bricks. I slid to the floor, my hands shaking. They weren't just here to stay. They were here to steal my son. I don't remember running upstairs, but suddenly I was in Ethan's room, kneeling by his crib. He was asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. I brushed his hair back, tears spilling down my cheeks, and whispered, "I won't let them take you, baby. I swear." My mind raced. Recordings, lawyers, courts. Margaret had power, money, and a plan. I had nothing but a box of letters and a breaking heart, but I wasn't nothing. I was his mom, and that had to count for something. The next morning, I confronted Jake. He was in the kitchen, sipping coffee like it was any other day. "Jake," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "did you know your mom's planning to take Ethan?" He choked, spilling coffee on the counter, his eyes wide. "What? No, she wouldn't." I cut him off. "I heard her last night. She's got a lawyer, recordings, everything. Are you in on this?" He wiped his hands, avoiding my gaze. "She's just worried about him, Amelia. You've been stressed. She thinks he'd be better off with stability." "Stability?" I stepped closer, my voice rising. "You think letting her rip him away from me is stability? You're okay with that?" He sighed, that infuriating sigh. "She's not serious. You're blowing this out of proportion." I wanted to scream, to shake him until he saw the truth, but I didn't. Instead, I turned and walked away, my resolve hardening with every step. Jake wasn't going to help. He was too deep in Margaret's web. I needed someone who'd fight with me, not against me. That night, I called Liam, my older brother. He picked up on the first ring, his voice warm and steady. "Hey, sis, you okay?" The dam broke. I told him everything. Margaret's takeover, the letters, the blackmail, the plan to take Ethan. My words tumbled out between sobs, and when I finished, there was silence. Then Liam's voice, sharp as steel. "She did what to Dad? And now Ethan. Why the hell are you letting her get away with this?" "I don't know," I whispered, my throat raw. "I don't know how to stop her." Liam didn't hesitate. "You do. You're tougher than this, Amelia. Dad always said you were the strong one. You've got those letters. Use them. Fight her. For Dad, for Ethan, for you." He paused, then added, "I knew something was off with Margaret. Dad hinted at it once, but I was too scared to push. I'm not scared now. What do you need?" I wiped my eyes, a flicker of hope sparking in my chest. "I need a plan." That's when it started. I bought a cheap recorder, hid it in my pocket, and started catching Margaret's venom on tape. Every snide comment, every threat. I called a lawyer friend from college, quietly, and asked about protecting Ethan. She warned me, "If they've got money and evidence, this could get ugly. Get proof of your own, fast." Then came the kicker. Digging through bank records, I found something Jake hadn't told me. He had transferred $500 K from my dad's estate into his name, claiming it as joint assets. He wasn't just complicit, he was profiting. I sat in the dark staring at Ethan's sleeping face, the recorder heavy in my hand. Margaret wanted a war, she'd get one. Jake thought he could play both sides, he'd lose everything. This wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about survival. And I was done being prey. I'd given Jake every chance to choose me, to choose us. I'd begged him to see what his mother was doing, to stand up for our family. But when I played that recording, her cold, calculated voice plotting to take my son, and saw the fear in his eyes, I knew the truth. This wasn't just Margaret's war. It was his too, and the price I paid for that realization, a betrayal so deep it ripped the last shred of trust I had left. The plan was simple, but brutal. I'd spent days gathering ammo, recordings of Margaret's venom, the letters from my dad, bank records of Jake's secret transfers. My lawyer friend, Sarah, had warned me, "You've got one shot, Amelia. Make it count or they'll bury you in court." I wasn't just fighting for Ethan anymore. I was fighting for my dad's honor, for the life he'd wanted for me. The showdown came on a Friday night, the air thick with tension. Margaret and Jake were in the living room, her sipping tea like a queen, him scrolling his phone, oblivious as ever. I walked in, recorder in hand, my heart pounding like a war drum. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. Margaret glanced up, her lips curling. "What now, Amelia? Another tantrum?" I ignored her, locking eyes with Jake. "This ends tonight. I know what you're planning." Before they could respond, I hit play. Margaret's voice filled the room, crisp and damning. "Amelia's a mess. We can prove she's unfit, take Ethan ourselves." Jake's head snapped up, his face paling. Margaret froze, her teacup trembling in her hand. "Where did you get that?" she hissed, standing so fast the cup clattered to the floor. "I recorded it," I said, stepping closer. "Every word. You think you can take my son? Threaten me in my own house? I've got more. Letters from my dad. Proof you blackmailed him for years, you destroyed him, and now you're coming for Ethan?" Jake stammered. "Amelia, wait, it's not..." I cut him off. "Shut up, Jake. I heard you too. Stability, right? You think letting her rip him away from me is stability?" Margaret's eyes narrowed, her mask slipping. "You little fool," she spat. "You think you can scare me with a tape? I'll sue you for everything, Ethan included. I've got recordings too, you screaming like a lunatic. No court will let you keep him." That's when it happened. She lunged for the recorder, her nails clawing at my arm. I yanked back, but she was faster than I'd expected, shoving me against the couch. "Give it to me," she snarled, her hands gripping my wrist. I fought, kicking, twisting until we both stumbled, crashing into the coffee table. Glass shattered, and from upstairs, Ethan's cry pierced the air. "Mommy!" My heart stopped. I shoved Margaret off, scrambling to my feet as his wails grew louder. She grabbed my ankle, pulling me down again, but then Jake's voice boomed, raw and desperate. "Stop it, Mom! Enough!" She froze, her grip loosening, and I broke free, running to Ethan. He was at the top of the stairs, clutching his teddy bear, tears streaming down his face. I scooped him up, holding him tight, whispering, "It's okay, baby, Mommy's here." Below, Margaret straightened, brushing her hair back like nothing had happened. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice ice cold. Jake just stood there, hands in his hair, muttering, "What the hell just happened?" I glared at them, Ethan sobbing into my shoulder. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "Both of you. Now." They left, Margaret dragging her suitcase, Thomas trailing silently behind, Jake lingering like he wanted to say something but didn't. The door slammed and the house fell quiet, save for Ethan's sniffles. I rocked him until he fell asleep, my mind reeling. I'd won the battle, but it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. That came later when I opened Jake's laptop, left behind in his rush to leave. I wasn't looking for anything, just closing it down. But an email popped up, already open, from someone named Sarah. Not my Sarah, but another. "Miss you, babe," it read. "Last night was incredible. When Mom gets Ethan, we're free. She's just the ticket to the $5 M, right?" My knees buckled. I scrolled, hands trembling, finding months of messages, pictures, hotel receipts, plans. "Amelia's clueless," he'd written. "Once Mom has the kid, I'm out." I sank to the floor, the laptop glowing in the dark, Ethan's breathing soft in the next room. He hadn't just let Margaret run the show, he'd orchestrated it. Played me for a fool while he built a new life with someone else. The house, the money, me, all pawns in his game. I wanted to scream, to smash something, but instead I cried, silent, wrenching sobs that shook my whole body. Then Ethan stirred, his little hand reaching for me in his sleep. I crawled to his crib, pressing my forehead to his, whispering, "Just you and me, baby, we're enough." The tears kept coming, but something shifted, a spark of steel in my spine. Jake thought he'd broken me, but he'd miscalculated. I called my lawyer that night, voice hoarse but steady. "Start the divorce, sell the house, I want him gone." Sarah's reply was calm, almost proud. "You got it, we'll make him pay." The war wasn't over, but I'd drawn the line. Margaret and Jake thought they could take everything. My home, my son, my soul. They were wrong. I'd burn it all down before I let them win. I'd sold the house, my dad's dream, my sanctuary, for $5 million. And with it, I'd cut the last tie to Jake and Margaret. I'd walked away from the divorce with Ethan in my arms and my head held high, but the final move I made, that's what split the world in two. Some called me a hero. Others said I'd cursed my son's future. Maybe they're both right. But as I stood there, watching Ethan giggle under a golden sunset, I knew one thing. I'd won my life back, and no one could take that from me. The weeks after that night were a whirlwind. I didn't waste time licking wounds. I acted. With Sarah's help, I filed for divorce, citing Jake's infidelity and Margaret's threats. The evidence was ironclad. The recordings, the letters, the bank transfers, those damning emails. Jake tried to fight it, his lawyer spinning tales of a misunderstanding, but the judge wasn't buying it. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice sharp as a gavel, "you've shown reckless disregard for your family. Custody to Ms. Carter, full and final." Margaret sat in the courtroom, stone-faced, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Thomas just stared at the floor, like he'd checked out long ago. When the gavel fell, I felt it. A weight lifting, a chain breaking. Ethan was mine, legally, forever. The house went next. I didn't want it anymore. Not with its ghosts, not with their fingerprints all over it. I called a realtor the day after they left, and within a week it was sold. $5 million cash, clean and quick. Jake didn't get a dime. The deed was in my name, and his sneaky transfers didn't hold up in court. I packed up Ethan's toys, my dad's old coffee mugs, and moved us to a cozy apartment downtown. Small, but ours. For the first time in months, I slept without nightmares. Ethan's soft snores, my only soundtrack. But I wasn't done. Those letters from my dad burned in my mind, a debt unpaid. Margaret had gotten away with too much, blackmailing him, breaking him, waltzing into my life like she owned it. So I did something reckless, something I knew would light a match. I posted them online, every word, every plea, on a blog I'd started, titled The Truth About the Pierce Family. I didn't name Ethan, didn't drag Jake through the mud beyond what he'd earned. But Margaret? I laid her bare. "This woman destroyed my father," I wrote. "She tried to take my son. She doesn't get to hide anymore." I hit publish, my hands shaking, and watched the internet explode. The response was instant. Thousands of shares, comments flooding in. "You're so brave, Amelia," some said. "Finally justice for your dad." Others weren't so kind. "You're selfish," they wrote. "Ethan will grow up with this shame. How could you? She's a mother-in-law, not a monster. Give her a break." The debate raged, splitting friends, strangers, even my own family. Liam called me, voice tight. "You sure about this, sis? It's out there now. No taking it back." I swallowed hard. "I had to, Liam. For Dad." He sighed. "I get it. Just be ready." The fallout hit fast. Jake lost his job. His startup couldn't handle the scandal. Clients bailing left and right. Margaret's social circle turned on her. Those fancy ladies she'd bragged to now whispered behind her back. One evening, as I locked up the coffee shop I'd started pouring my heart into, a little place called Dad's Brew, Jake showed up. He looked like a wreck. Unshaven, eyes hollow. "Amelia," he said, his voice cracking, "I've got nothing left. Job's gone. Mom won't talk to me. Sarah dumped me. I messed up. God, I know I did. Please help me." I stared at him, the man I'd once loved, now a stranger begging on my doorstep. A flicker of pity stirred, but it wasn't enough. "Jake," I said, calm and cold, "you chose this. You chose her. You chose Sarah. You chose everything but us. I forgive you. Not for you, but for me. But I'm done saving you." He flinched, tears welling up, and for a moment I thought he'd argue. Instead, he nodded, shoulders sagging, and walked away into the dusk. That night, in our new apartment, I found something that broke me open all over again. Tucked in a box of Dad's things, stuff I hadn't unpacked, was a letter I'd missed. His handwriting, steady this time, dated the day before he died. "Amelia, my light," it read. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder Didn't tell you about her, but you're stronger than me. Always were. Don't let anyone dim you. Give Ethan the life I couldn't. I love you. I sank to the floor, sobbing, clutching the paper like it was him. Ethan toddled over, his little arms wrapping around me, and I held him tight, tears soaking his hair. We'll make him proud, baby, I whispered. I promise. The next evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat on our tiny balcony, Ethan on my lap. He scribbled on a pad, crayons everywhere, then held up his drawing, 2 stick figures, me and him, under a big yellow sun. Us, Mommy, he said, grinning. I laughed through tears, kissing his forehead. The house was gone, the past a scar. But this was ours. Jake could beg, Margaret could rage, the world could judge, but I'd found my peace. I'd lost everything I thought mattered, only to gain what did. And as that golden light bathed us, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning.